Hey everybody, welcome to this 27 Virtual podcast. My name is William Grismore.
And I'm Andrew Grismore.
My role with 27 Virtual is primarily as the senior architect. Andrew?
I am an SE, as well as I go out and do marketing events, talk at VMUG user cons, maybe you've seen me before, and also work on some projects as well to stay sharp.
And you are a Florida man, is that right?
I am a Florida man.
We're all Florida men. So welcome to our podcast. We're just going to talk today about federation. So there's been a lot of talk over the last several years about this new feature coming to NSX-T called federation. So what we want to do is just start out with single site versus multi-site, and then we'll kind of work our way up into federation.
Yeah, I think the first time that I heard the word federation used around NSX-T was when we went to that very first training that was open to non-VMware employees out in Palo Alto. We were looking at what, NSX-T 1 dot something?
Yeah, 1 or 2 or something like that.
Yeah. And now we're at NSX 3.1 for T, and we finally get to taste it here.
Yeah, there was like what 3.0.1 and 2, and then it wasn't ready for prime time, and then it was, and then there's limits and so on. But the federation is pretty interesting. So if I'm a customer and I have NSX-T, if I have 2 sites, I have the option to have 2 completely separate sites if I choose to. I don't have to do multi-site, or I can choose to leverage the NSX-T multi-site deployment. So if I do an NSX-T multi-site, just the very first thing to be clear about is there's a difference between multi-site and federation. Mm-hmm. Right? That'd be the first thing. So there are 2 different concepts, and there's different types of multi-sites. And the biggest consideration about multi-site is what the latency is between data centers. So if I have less than 10 millisecond latency, or I have like a metro cluster where my data centers are very close to each other in the same metropolitan area, I got a dark fiber connection or whatever, I could have 2 data centers, and they could be completely separate vCenters in those 2 data centers, or they can be a stretch cluster. And those are kind of different scenarios. If I have something greater than 10 milliseconds, I have more disparate data centers, like one in, I don't know, one in Orlando and one in Atlanta, let's just say. So my latency is probably not going to be where I really need it to be. So I can still do a multi-site configuration, but I can't do a multi-site configuration with automatic failover. So if I go back down to 2 data centers and they're within this kind of, I think VMware would recommend to keep it more around 7 to 8 milliseconds, because you start getting to 10 as it going above 10. We want to keep it really low. And then if I have it low enough, 5 milliseconds, and I can actually have my storage stretch between the 2 in that metro design, then I can have a stretch cluster, and I can actually have a multi-site configuration where it's automatic failover, where if I have one NSX-T edge at one data center that's active at my primary, and again, we're only like 5 milliseconds apart, then I have another edge at the other site that's standby. Those 2 edges are in one tier 0 configuration. And if I lose my primary site, that secondary can just take over. So it's pretty straightforward. If I have 2 different vCenters, and let's say I'm back up to I'm more like around 7 to 8 milliseconds. I'm not fast enough to support the stretch storage or the asynchronous kind of replication between arrays, and I have separate vCenters and separate clusters, I can still do multi-site. But the question now becomes, where do my managers sit? NSX-T managers only sit, say, at one of the data centers. There's another caveat of having a stretch layer 2 in hardware between the data centers that can be somewhat helpful to help with the management plane failover. But without going too deep, basically, if you have 2 data centers, 2 separate vCenters, 2 separate vSphere environments, you can do multi-site. But if you're above that speed where it's going to really provide what you need from a storage perspective, you're thinking about, where do my managers sit? And then failing those managers over. And then if you get to, the higher speeds, it's even less likely you could even stretch that layer 2 network for that management plane to make it a little bit easier. And now I have to think about, if a primary site fails, I can recover, but depending on the design, you may not be able to recover, say, fully for say 15 to 30 minutes, because I have to recover the management plane to the other site. So what I can actually do instead of having one single set of NSX managers at just one site, I can actually have them spread across two. So Andrew, if I want to go from single site to multi-site, that's kind of been the traditional solution so far, right? So what's the benefit? So can you talk to me a little bit about what the benefit would be to go from single site is straightforward enough. If I go to a multi-site to federation, so what's all the buzz about with federation? Why would I want to go there?
Yeah, so it sounds like there are plenty of options and considerations already, and it sounds like you can do multi-site without federation. So there's got to be something here to the federation that really makes a big difference. And you talked a little bit about the management plane, you talked about the recovery of managers, and probably the most glaring difference between multi-site without federation, which you can definitely do, and multi-site with federation is the redundancy of your NSX managers, where they live and how many you're dealing with. So let's start there as just one of the base benefits of federation is that you're going to have what are called a set of global managers. So these global managers, you'll have an active set, you'll have a standby at another site. And what that does is it gives you management plane redundancy and the ability to recover quickly via these global managers if your primary site goes down. So you're going to have primary global managers. You're going to have a set of local managers, which actually are the ones still in charge of making sure everything actually works and pushing out the configuration locally to those hosts there. And then you'll have another location where it has the standby set of global managers, and then another set of local managers to, again, actually deal with and manage the ESXi host, your transport nodes, your edges over there on that side as well. So biggest initial, just look at it right off the page difference is you're going to see more managers, you're going to see redundancy of the managers across the sites, and a lot of the considerations that were made doing multi-site with NSX-T before federation about where your managers live, how we deal with the recovery, that just becomes a whole lot easier. Of course, that's just the beginning of the benefits of federation. So that management plane redundancy and availability is a huge part of it. But there's also some benefits in terms of dealing with these sites that could be relatively, far away. They could be transcontinental. They could even cross oceans. And you can utilize this federation to make it so that your networking and the management of that networking and the firewall rules is easier across those locations, because the way that we actually do the networking in federation is a little bit different as well. So you want to talk about that a little bit and where the RTEP comes into play?
Right. So just to summarize, so people can track with us. So in multi-site, you're going to have one set of managers. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it might not sound like, if you've never heard this before, multi-site is an interesting concept in T, because multi-site, you're going to have just one set of managers. So even though there's multiple sites, you're going to have one set of managers. And I think that's kind of the glaring, from a management plane perspective, right? That's the big difference. And then, so just to be clear, Andrew, with federation, I'm going to have one site with 3 local managers, my own vCenter. The other site's going to have 3 local managers in my own vCenter. Now, those local managers and those vCenters, other than just regular single sign-on to vCenter, they're really not, the NSX managers don't talk to each other. Is that right? The local managers.
The local managers, correct. Yeah.
So they're 2 independent stacks. And I can actually start out that way. So if I'm not even sure about federation, I could just keep it like that. So right away, if I compare multi-site to federation, the very first difference is 3 local managers at site A, 3 local managers at site B. And then I can then decide to federate. I'm going to have 3 global at one site and active, like Andrew said, and 3 at the other. So the biggest glaring difference is you're going to go from having 3 managers if you had 2 sites to having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 managers. You're going to have 12 managers. It sounds like a lot of managers, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, there are resource considerations to be sure. You don't necessarily have to have 3 global standby managers, but it's certainly an option and something to consider. So resources are something you're going to have to look at, but again, it gives you a lot of benefits.
So the first check is based on the size of the managers, based on the customer's environment. You're going to have to look to see if you have enough resources to support the 6 managers at both sites, and then enough resources, say if you have a management cluster or not, enough other resources to run everything else you need. So then I guess then the next question would be, so if I go to this federation, why am I federating? So what's the reason a customer would want to federate? The management plane is obvious, right? So now I got the managers at both sides. What's the other reason for federating? You talked about the RTEP.
Yeah, so the way that we stretch networks is going to be a little bit different in federation. And on top of that, you get the benefit of having an active stretch tier 0, if you choose to, across the sites as well, which is something that's a brand new concept to NSX-T.
So I want to federate because I'm going to have a redundant management plane. So if site A dies, I can more easily bring up site B. I don't have to worry about load balancing the one set of managers possibly across 3 sites or whatever the case may be there with the physical load balancer. I don't have to worry about maybe putting 1 manager at one site and 2 at the other and ending up in a split brain scenario. It eliminates all those concerns from a management plane. And then I can stretch the network between the sites. Now, in multi-site, I can stretch the network between the sites still, correct?
Yes, you can.
And so I can stretch the network between the sites with multi-site. But if I need to fail over, I can run into some challenges in recovery. Where with federation, I can also stretch the networks between the sites with that stretch tier 0 that you just mentioned. But the difference is the management plane is always going to be there. So if I lose site A, I'll have site B. It's federated. The network is stretched. I have my consistent security for that stretched network segment. So I have possibly site recovery manager or whatever I'm using to fail my VMs over. And I'm able to fail the VMs over, and that management plane is available depending on the exact scenario. I can have instant access to the network, and with a couple of API calls or click, 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 I can go in there and actually, bring those things up on the other side.
I like your ode to Dimitri there.
Yeah, so we can definitely, make that happen. So the short summary of why I would federate would be, in my mind, would be faster failover the management plane. I can stretch the network in federation just like I can with multi-site, but the difference is I don't have to worry about bringing the management plane up to have instant access to network services, and I have a consistent security across the two sites.
Yep, I think there's one more benefit that we can talk about, and that is the consideration of MTU across the sites as well. Because when you use the RTEP, although it is recommended to have the larger frame size, you can actually do an MTU of 1500 across your sites and still get the encapsulation via the remote TEPs going from edge to edge. So you can actually stretch networks and use them across multiple sites and not need an MTU of 1600 or higher from your provider of that link, and do the stretched encapsulated networking as well. So that's a pretty significant change to how it was done before if you choose to do it that way.
Right. So in NSX-V, And with NSX-T and multi-site, if a VM on site A is actually talking to a VM on site B, which many times they're not, but if they are,
may or may not, yeah,
may or may not, but if they are actually talking to each other across that WAN link, business continuity, whatever the case may be, then in those scenarios, across that WAN link, it's got to support that MTU in V of 1600 or NT of 17. So if we go to federation and we use the RTEP, so your question to me earlier, which I didn't directly answer the first time, is the RTEP allows you to do it at just 1500. So that's a pretty big benefit. So customers that don't have WAN links or their service provider can't guarantee the larger MTU, they can take advantage of federation and extend that network where before they couldn't if they need to have the VM in site A talking the VM in site B, if they do that, business continuity or some particular use case.
Yep, exactly. So that's a new element there, and I highly recommend you guys go out and check out how the flows actually work in federation as our multi-site traffic flows through the remote TEPs that live inside your edge devices, and it's a new tunnel endpoint that's assigned from the global manager, which is pretty interesting. Well, you can go through the global manager. It's actually assigned from the local managers, but it's more of a global style configuration to allow for the federation and the stretch networking in federation to take place. Then I would say the last benefit, or not the last, but one more benefit of note to talk about here is the ability to do what we used to kind of consider as that local egress feature in NSX-V and do that in NSX-T. So your stretch tier 0 can either be an active passive in multiple locations, and it can also be an active across multiple locations. And you can actually do your routing based off of locationality and direct flows that source in one site through one location's edges that has that stretch tier 0. And you could also have another location where the traffic goes north through the edges in that location as well. So this federation, because we have multiple sites, it actually allows us to use and consume that locationality, and it has an understanding of scope. So when you're in the NSX-T interface and you start seeing this scope drop down, what it's really meaning here is if you're doing federation, you can choose for the scope of routing or firewall rules or groupings to be a part of a particular location and use that to your advantage for steering flows, and so on as it comes to dealing with your multiple locations. So now you get to deal with your multiple locations, your multi-site via federation, and do individual things at each one of those and still consume a shared tier 0, which is a really cool concept and definitely a huge benefit of doing the federation as well.
So I can have 2 edges in site A in an edge cluster and 2 edges in site B in an edge cluster and create this stretched tier 0 that stretches all the way across both environments. But can I also have an other set of edges that are just local if I want to?
Yes, so you can do local, you can do local location-based edges. You can have global edges. It's just a matter of where the tier 0 lives. So you can have a local tier 0 coming from your local managers, but the global tier 0 will come from the global managers. And you'll get a little icon next to it that says it's a GM or a globally managed object.
I love those little icons. All right, so I'm currently a traditional NSX-T customer. I started out with, I don't know, version 2.4, and I've kind of upgraded. I'm on 3.1. Whatever the latest version is, and I'm still in a multi-site configuration where I have just one set of managers. Can I transition to federation if I want to?
Yeah, so here's where doing the field work, I think, because you and I are both instructors, me more of a past life, you still do it, and I know it's a big part of who you are as a teacher and instructor, but we both know that the classroom doesn't always equate to what goes on in the real world, and you'd think, hey, I'm doing multi-site, and I'm doing my multi-site with NSX-T right now. I started off in 2.5. We're now in the 3s, and we have this federation, and I want to take advantage of it. Well, That's great, but you have to have the understanding that your current, let's say you have site A with your set of managers there, you have your site B, and it's all within the same NSX-T umbrella. Well, you can't have an additional new set of NSX managers now at the same time control the transport nodes that are already prepped and a part of another NSX-T set of managers. It just doesn't work that way. And in order for federation to work, you need some in location A, you need your local managers to control that location. In location B, you need your local managers to control that location. So as it stands right now, it's a bit of a finesse where you have to remove what's going on from the locally controlled managers in your site A that stretches across via the traditional multi-site, and then reinstall your NSX components over there in the secondary site, create your edges that are going to be used globally, and then you can deploy your global managers and put them all under the global umbrella, and then create your global objects that stretch across. So just know that it's a bit of a process now. Us as 27 Virtual, since we're always out there doing the newest NSX things, staying on the cutting edge, we've done this process. We've seen what it's like. So if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out. But it's just something that you should consider. And what I would warn to the listeners who are listening to this and looking at NSX as a solution going forward is really carefully consider whether you're going to do federation or the more traditional multi-site, because once you make the decision to do that multi-site, the older version without federation, you put yourself in a place where going to federation, at least as it stands right now, is a bit of a process.
Yeah, you got to kind of, NSX-T is kind of like an onion, right?
Yeah.
You have to unravel all these different layers. It's like you just can't go over to site B and say, God, I want to uninstall NSX-T. You have to kind of go through and remove this and remove that and kind of
the
reverse
foundation
back
of the
to that.
transport zone, the segments, the tier 1s, the tier 0s. And speaking of tier 1s and some of the services that we might think about putting into our NSX environment, talk about some of the limitations that come with federation as it stands today.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting that you can do federation, but you've got to go in with a good checklist of what it can and can't do. So, what it can do is, either, active standby or active with some different configurations. You can stretch the tier 0 between the two sites, which also means a stretched ASN number for BGP North. What would take me to my first limit would be that it's going to support BGP and static routing. And static routing is supported primarily with a configuration where you have a tier 0 SR, which is stretched for your routing, and a tier 0 DR. Once you add in that T1 underneath, you really need to get up into BGP to repropagate those routes north. So there's some limitations there. So OSPF is not supported with federation. OSPF is supported with multi-site, but VMware is trying to lead customers to BGP. Customers that have OSPF, they'll talk about convergence time. There are some truths to that OSPF has got a faster convergence time for sure. But moving forward, we're looking at BGP for support. And we don't really see OSPF on a roadmap at this time, at least not yet anyway. So that's definitely the first and foremost, that's the first thing you want to look at, would be that limitation. A couple other ones, there's something new that came out not too long ago called a VRF Lite. The VRF Lite is not supported when you have a tier 0 SR. You can only have one tier 0 per edge cluster. So you can't do anything with these VRF Lites across the environment. You can't do any of the third-party vendor network introspection, like with Palo Alto or any other third-party vendor, or guest introspection type stuff, like with the Trend Micro Deep Security. So some of those certain features are not built or understand kind of that stretch network. So there are a few limits there. But if you're looking primarily just to stretch the layer 2 for business continuity for DR, you're going to get all those features there that you need. So there are a few limits. You can definitely check out the Federation design guide to take a look at those in more detail. that for sure is available to you. Make sure you take a look at that. But just go in with open eyes, know what it can and can't do, and you'll make a decision, based on what we have. We can either do multi-site or we can do federation. But the main thing that Andrew just said, which is important, is that if you think you're going to go federation and you're okay with those limits, you want to go that way. You don't want to have to deploy multi-site and then get into the unraveling of the onion, down the road.
I agree.
So that would kind of be my 2 cents. But I think federation is a great way to go. I highly recommend it. Just make sure you check out those limitations. Be ready for the deployment and the steps involved. Gives you a lot of flexibility, kind of 2 independent sites if you want them, plus the stuff that's stretched within those limits. Again, BGP and static routing is supported. It works great, and definitely check it out.
Awesome. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, send us an email. We'd be happy to hop on a call. And if you have any questions about it, we can talk about it more specific to your environment. But thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Great. Thank you.